some work here for the week beginning the 27th of April. We're going to be analysing and evaluating a couple of historical sources to do with the execution of Charles I. And the first slide we're going to look at is actually some feedback on the work that you were doing before Easter. So, general feedback. I was pleased. A lot of the paragraphs were as the one below, where the ape structure was very clearly being used, with all aspects of it being utilised, bringing in own knowledge and bringing in provenance to evaluate the credibility of the source. And both of those things were done well. EBI, the few answers, you didn't start off with a sentence that answers the question. It's always important to do that. Provenance tended to be fairly good. Sometimes there wasn't quite enough own knowledge. And a few of you just needed to be careful because you were making the point that it was a letter from Charles to Henrietta, so it was likely to be truthful, but you didn't really explain why. You didn't develop that, so it just needed developing a little bit. And then below here you can see an example of a really good answer that's got all the component parts. You can see that I've colour coded it, so you can read through that and you can see how the structure of it works. I'm not going to read it through. You can freeze the screen or you can print it out. So with all of that in mind, what we'll do now is we will have a look at a couple of sources to do with the execution of Charles. So source B is a recollection from a soldier called William Allen, talking through the decision-making process of why Charles had to be killed. And he says, we came to a clear agreement that we had to go out and fight our enemies, and that if God ever brought us victory, then we should call Charles Stuart, that man of blood, to account for the blood he has shed and the evil he has done against God's cause and people. So what it's saying there is the decision was kind of made even before the Second Civil War started, that if Charles lost, it would be a clear sign from God. He goes on to say, God led us to victory at the very time when the king was negotiating with Parliament and both of them wanting a peace. Yet this was prevented by God's will. The king was taken to prison and then to execution. Okay, so if we analyse and evaluate source B, straight away we can see source B is telling us, William Allen is telling us, that the army had very much a providential view, that if Charles was defeated in the Second Civil War, then God would be passing a judgment on Charles and a judgment on kingship, and that he would have to account for his actions, which means a trial. And this suggests very strongly that actually the main reason for Charles's execution was the outcome of the Second Civil War. So that's the main thing. It does also hint at other reasons. It talks about negotiation, and it says that the army was totally against Charles and conservative Presbyterians reaching a settlement. So it hints that the Second Civil War was not the only reason, that maybe the army was opposed to any kind of settlement involving Charles. Now I'm going to leave you to bring in your own knowledge here, but I will give you some help with the provenance. So it's written by an ex-soldier. I think what's important here is he was clearly religious. He was a member of the New Model Army, so he was fighting in a sense for God's cause, and he called his memoir a faithful memoir. He's basically saying, I am going to give a truthful account before God of what happened. And that does strengthen the credibility of the source. You could maybe make the point also that it's written during Cromwell's rule, and he may have felt safe at this point to be truthful with what he's saying. So the provenance suggests it's quite credible. And with that in mind, we're then asking the question overall, how supportive is source B of the idea that the main reason why Charles is executed is the Second Civil War? And the content is very supportive. Okay, it hints at other reasons, but on the whole, it is very supportive. And this is strengthened, the credibility of this view is strengthened by the provenance. Okay, it is a pretty credible source. So overall, we would say that source B is strongly supportive. So if we have a look at source D is a speech given in Parliament by a Republican MP, Thomas Scott, and this is what he says. He says, "It was agreed to kill the king if he would not preserve religion and liberty. It is impossible that anyone should support a man of so much blood as the king was. He was 7 or 8 times sent propositions and would not yield. So long as he was obstinate, there were daily revolts in the army and risings in all places. He caused trouble for us all, and it was impossible to allow him to live. Execution was the last resort." Okay, so let's analyse and evaluate what Thomas Scott said in Parliament on the 7th of February and evaluate how much it supports the focus of the question. Well, what Scott is doing here is actually suggesting that there were a number of reasons why Charles was executed. He was saying Charles was executed because he was a tyrant, he would not preserve religion and liberty, which harks back to, I suppose, Charles's time during personal rule. He was saying Charles was executed because he wouldn't compromise. He talks about 7 or 8 propositions. They may be exaggerating here slightly, but certainly there's some credibility to this, isn't there? The Newcastle proposition, the Heads-of propositions. He wouldn't compromise. Charles wouldn't compromise. He was playing for time, and we know this because we've seen this in letters to Henrietta Maria. He goes on to state that Charles was killed for the stability of the nation. There were revolts in the army. True. We had the level of mutinies that Cromwell had to put down, and he says that there were risings in all places, and again this is true. After Charles had made his engagement with the Scots, there were risings all over the country in support of Charles. He also definitely alludes to the impact of the Second Civil War. He says that Charles was killed because of the Second Civil War, and that there was so much blood that Charles was responsible for. So really, Scott is throwing the kitchen sink at this. Okay. Now, in terms of the credibility of what he's saying, there's certainly quite a lot of own knowledge that supports what Scott is saying. The provenance, well, okay, he is a person, he had first-hand knowledge of why the death warrant was signed because he signed it. He was literally in the room, so in terms of that, he would surely have a good understanding of it. He is a Republican MP, obviously. He's heavily involved in regicide. He might be being slightly disingenuous. He might be trying to make the case against Charles as strong as possible by bringing in lots of different factors to validate his own actions, to justify his own actions. I guess he is in a vulnerable position because he's one of the people who actually literally signed his name on the death warrant. Okay, so in terms of provenance, there is an element of him trying to justify his actions and putting the best spin on it possible. However, a lot of what he says is essentially correct. And actually, the evidence does suggest it. You know, he really was killed as a last resort, and it wasn't something that Cromwell or the grandees took lightly in terms of decision. So, how supportive of it is? How supportive of the idea that the execution was the main reason? It ain't massively supportive, really. It gives 4 main reasons why Charles was executed, and actually the Second Civil War was only one of them. The provenance, it's mixed, isn't it? You know, he was there, he was one of the people who signed it, he had a first-hand view of it, so that might strengthen the credibility of what he's saying. At the same time, he might be over-egging the pudding a little bit to justify his own actions. So bear all of those things in mind when you are. So, in terms of your overall answer, the structure of this, first of all, you want a very, very brief introduction, setting the scene a little bit. Charles I was executed January 1649. Sources B and D give different explanations of why this happened. And then go through the ape structure with source B. And then when you've done that, link it to source D, making the point that they're saying different things. Then go through the ape structure for source D. And then after that, because the question is asking how far do the two sources support the idea, your conclusion, you have to say how much overall the two sources support the idea of the Second Civil War being the main reason for the execution. And if you feel that one of the sources offers slightly more credibility than the other, that might weight your overall conclusion in a certain direction, and you could bring that in as well. Okay, so have a go. Have a go at answering this. My ideal preference would be if you typed it up on Word, and then if you upload it onto the Teams method of uploading it, that would be the best. If you cannot upload it onto Word, if you want to write it, then write it. Take a photo of your writing, and then just stick those photos on a Word document and upload it again onto the Teams, the Microsoft Teams, rather than Bloodle. Okay, thanks very much.